Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bloomberg Businessweek Weekend podcast. Well, earnings season got into full swing. So too has the final stretch of the election, as we are a little over 2 weeks to go until U.S. voters head to the polls. Keep in mind, many in some states have already casted their ballots. Early voting is underway. We have several takes on the elections this week, from free speech and fearless speech to how the men who governed America governed their own money. Yes, we mean the U.S. presidents. That coming up in our next hour.
This hour, the company that invented blue jeans more than 150 years ago on today's crowded marketplace. The Levi's CFO stops by. Plus, the CEO of Gusto has his pulse on small and medium-sized businesses. He shares what he's seeing as he builds out his rapidly growing business.
First up, we begin with geopolitics and the U.S. election. From the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war to the U.S. campaign trail and beyond. One name at the top of our list when we want to cover it all is
Ed Price. He's a former British trade official, now non-resident senior fellow at NYU. Also principal for geopolitical forecasting at the global intelligence and consulting firm Ergo. He's advised members of the European and British parliaments. And we started by talking about his summer road trip.
So I drove from New York to San Francisco via the northerly route, and then I drove back via the south, via Dallas, via New Orleans, and really just tried to stop as much as possible and just make conversation, right? Just stop someone and say, hey, how are you? By the way, what do you think about the election? What do you think about the economy?
And everyone greeted you with open arms, right?
Right. So this is the interesting thing. We've heard this so many times. Jimmy Carville, it's the economy, stupid. It kind of is and it kind of isn't. And one of the things that I noticed most was that in any given generic conversation with anyone, really, after they'd said, oh, you know what, I really hate the other guy, right, the other candidate, they would then basically come up with a list of things that they wanted whoever it is that's president to do at home that were very similar. And so there's, we always talk about polarization in this country. That is the case. But there's also this sort of bipartisan feeling that somehow, some way, the economy could be better. Now, that might mean that, Harris is in trouble because it's in some ways her economy. But it's interesting to me that so many Americans said exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that's what you came away with.
But it's also so in stark contrast to so much data out there. Data point after data point, Carol, showing that for a lot of people, the economy is really good.
Exactly. And yet there's a lot of Americans, as you know, Ed, that don't feel so good. I mean, based on your conversations, did you get a feel of who might ultimately win come November? We know it's a very close race. We see the polls. We are reminded of it daily or hourly. But did you get a good feel of which way it could go? And is it just based on the signs that were on people's lawns?
Oh, my goodness. Okay, listen, if presidents were elected via signage, Donald Trump would be the Roman emperor. Because I can tell you guys, in hand on heart, I didn't see a single Harris sign in the Rust Belt. I didn't see a single Harris sign. No, seriously.
I know, I get it. I went around the country a lot in the last couple of months. One question I'll ask, though, is when were you doing this? What month? Because remember, July 21st is when Biden dropped out.
Yeah.
And the signs weren't around. The signs weren't around for a while.
So August, the whole month of August. It's a really good point about data. And of course, it might be that the missing signs just aren't there because either they haven't been printed or because people don't want to put them up. In which case, you might say that Richard Nixon's silent majority is going to go blue this year. But I've got to tell you, and I'll declare my bias. I'm voting this time. I'm voting against Donald Trump. So there's my bias. Me not seeing a single Harris sign and seeing ginormous Trump signs, you can't help but think, okay, this guy's going to win.
It's a good point. I think I've talked about this before, but I was in Colorado a few weeks ago. It seemed like there were two things that I'll share. One is that there were a lot of local signs that were clearly proclaiming the way one person felt, like who the candidates were that they were voting for, that didn't necessarily, Ed, have a presidential sign with them. So it was like county commissioner, Congress, and local state legislature signs but not necessarily signs proclaiming president, which I thought really interesting, showing the way people were thinking down ballot.
That's super interesting too. And where I live, I'm in a red county, but I'm getting leaflets from both sides, both parties, and they've stopped putting their political party on them, just the name of the candidate, which I think is maybe another interesting data point.
I do also wonder, so much. There was an interesting Times story, actually, the New York Times, and it said the Trump voters who don't believe Trump. When the former president endorses violence and proposes using the government to attack his enemies, many of his supporters assumes it's just an act. I actually had a conversation with an individual over the past week when we were out on the West Coast. Same thing, said, I just think when the former president, Donald Trump, says things, he's just trying to kind of put people off, if you will, whether it's allies, whether it's political opponents, just kind of shake things up. But not that he's necessarily going to follow through with all these things. We know from his first administration, he does follow through with some things. But I wonder what you make of that argument or that thinking.
I wouldn't want to take the risk, frankly. As I say, I have a bias. I think he's a clear and present danger, to borrow from Tom Clancy, to the United States Constitution. That's my view. But the interesting thing I think about sort of, me turning up in hunting stores and 7-Elevens and not being a pollster and not really being a journalist is that very often I would speak to people who do support Trump, but then they'd give me like the second and third layer too. And one guy that comes to mind, he's running a hunting store in Oregon. But he sort of said to me, I'm voting Trump, but there are things I don't like about the guy, and I wouldn't talk like that in front of my kids. So, that's still there. And maybe I got to hear a bit more of that because, who am I? Nobody. I'm not a pollster.
Yeah, I guess the question is to what extent these folks show up. And also based on where you were, Ed, Oregon, a state like Oregon, not exactly a swing state right now. I mean, the Pennsylvania observation that you made were really interesting. And you did drive through a lot of swing states, certainly. But it's, as you know, we live in a world where the Electoral College, and I think Mark Gongloff, our columnist at Bloomberg Opinion who covers climate change, described as basically a football stadium full of people deciding the election.
Oof. Yes, that's probably true. So look, I'm back in New York State now. Probably some of those people aren't too far away in Pennsylvania. This was non-scientific, as I say, but if you just based it on visual evidence, conversational evidence, it feels like on the surface of things, Trump has this in the bag. Now, that said, there's always that chance that, as we know, in an election this close, that the other side pips through for some reason or other. But my feeling is that Trump could really get to the end here.
So, Ed, why did you write about this in the context of the silent majority in the Richard Nixon area? Why go back there?
Well, I think in part it's because I also have this side hustle teaching students, right? And I've been doing that for like 5 or 6 years now. Really enjoy it. But I've seen a change in the body politic, so to speak, of the student body. And it seems to me that there's at least one parallel with the Vietnam War, which is that there are moralistic imperatives in the minds of protesters to oppose U.S. foreign policy. Now, for me, that's false. That's not an equivalence that works because Vietnam was, as things turned out, an error, and the war that Israel's fighting was imposed on it. But, Richard Nixon was really trying to say in that speech that, look, you may not hear the people out there for Richard Nixon. He liked to speak about himself in the third person, but they're out there, they're just not protesting. And so the question was, are the people that aren't really out on the streets, are the people that aren't displaying big Trump signs thinking about voting for Harris? And I'm afraid to say I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like there's a fair amount of questions about, that and just kind of then what it means for the outcome. I am also curious, Ed, you're back from overseas. We talk a lot about whether it's U.S. allies, their concerns about the outcome of the election. What insight can you give us on that front?
I think from my perspective, from European ties that I have, foreigners in the UK and Europe think this is probably an existential election. I'm heading over to Japan in a couple of months. I imagine they think the same thing. And a lot of this comes down to NATO, right? And whether or not, if Trump is reelected, he goes and does, to your point, Carol, about whether he actually does the things he says, actually does go ahead and pull the US out of NATO in a meaningful way. And that's probably a segue at some point into the Ukrainian behavior on the battlefield. So foreigners right now, I think, are really scratching their heads about how exactly there could be such a bifurcated choice in the world of foreign policy between what we presume Harris will do and what Trump might. There's one caveat. They do seem to be joined at the hip in agreeing that Beijing is a problem. And it does seem whoever wins, as we know, trade policy will continue down a confrontational path.
It is amazing to me, Ed, or not surprising, that there was a period where every day one of the top stories on the Bloomberg had to do with the war between those two countries. Obviously, now we have the Middle East we're following, and that is atop the lists of concerns. Geopolitically, though, let's talk about Russia, Ukraine, and where you think this might go and how the U.S. election outcome, might impact that.
Well, thank you, Carl. I mean, it's astonishing and sad that we've been talking to each other now for years about this war, and it's entering its third winter. So I think where it's gone is more or less where the broad analytical community expected it to go, which was stalemate. There are, of course, two caveats to that. One is time, which is that the Russians are fighting a war of attrition. And the other is, for want of a better phrase, bravery, in that the Ukrainians have now thrust into the Kursk region with their own offensive. My interpretation of that offensive is that it is designed as a message, a plea to the United States, saying, look, we can do the job. We have the will, give us the means. And of course, we are still sitting on decisions such as whether or not long-range weaponry should be allowed to be used on Russian soil. So a lot will come down to who's sitting in the White House, I think.
What do you say to U.S. citizens who might be like, well, it's the Europeans' problem? Say it's for the Europeans to figure out, to support, to provide funding and weapons. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that Munich in 1938 was the Europeans' problem. And then after that, Poland in 1939 was the Europeans' problem. And then after that, it wasn't. It was ours. It was America's problem. And America has a fundamental core national interest in containing, if not defeating, aggressive military powers in the world. I mean, this is almost one of the top three American things, right? It's like apple pie, the aforementioned freedom, and beating dictators. So, I'm surprised when I hear that narrative. I think it's tied in a strange way to this Trump wing of the Republican Party, if there's another wing left, in which Russia is held up as an example. Hungary is held up as an example of how to do business, how to run a country. It's very strange. But of course, it's patently false. And should Putin defeat Ukraine in the field, we're in a world of trouble.
Meaning what? There'll be Poland or something else next?
Well, first of all, dictatorships everywhere will be emboldened. I think that there's an obvious link between the relationship between Russia and Iran was obviously emboldened to embolden others such as Hezbollah and Hamas to attack Israel. So this is not one war. This war is an ecosystem. But meaning as well that the revanchist nationalist Russia that Putin has unleashed in the last decade or so, and that we have failed to confront, does have its eyes on the restoration of a former Tsarist empire. It's not the Soviet model. This is a red herring. It's the Tsarist imperial model of Russia, in which there are these vassals, these occupied vassals around its borders as a form of self-defense. You can perfectly well imagine why the Russians are paranoid. They've been invaded several times. Believe it or not, British and Japanese troops have been on Russian soil in the 20th century and so on. But unless we, the West, properly confront this aggression, I forecast that it will only get worse.
Okay, so make the case then, if members of the U.S. House and Senate are listening or watching right now, make the case as to why you believe it's essential to support Ukraine.
So there's an idealistic case and there is a practical case. The idealistic case is the one that I just gave you. I would appeal to any elected official in the United States. I would appeal to their heart and I would say, look, America has a unique role in the world. Jefferson let the genie out of the bottle. It's a good genie. It's about human freedom and it should be universal. That's the idealistic case. There's also a monetary case, right? There's a fiscal case, which is how much money do you want to spend putting Putin back in his box? And as far as I'm concerned, this is cynical. You could say, well, who really cares about Ukraine? What we really want is to defeat and degrade Russian power. And by the way, I think we've been doing that. So I think that Putin has made tactical gains measured in years, but has probably set himself back strategically as measured in decades, right? So he's not invincible. The Kursk offensive has shown this. And if we just want to send a rounding error of our national budget and inventory that we otherwise would have mothballed to brave people fighting for freedom, that's an idealistic thing, but it's also very practical because, again, otherwise, you think about Ukraine going down. I mean, then, Poland, the Baltics are in trouble, or Putin says that's enough for now and sends all of his expertise and or materiel soldiers, say, to Iran in a war with Israel. So we really have to think about this practically as well.
Hey, Ed, one thing I wanted to ask you also, coming back from being in the UK and overseas, are people getting frustrated with the U.S. support of Israel?
Yes, but they shouldn't be. This is a very sensitive topic. I recently wrote an op-ed about this. I thought very carefully about writing it, but I did. And it asked 3 questions. One, is Israel fighting a war of self-defense? The answer is yes. The second question was, is Israel conducting a genocide? And the answer is no. And then the third question was, is Israel bringing us all to the brink of World War III? And the answer was, I don't know. If you spend more time thinking about security in terms of appeasement, and 1938, as I mentioned, then Israel was attacked and is doing the absolute right thing in defending itself. If you think this is more like a 1962 Cuban Missile scenario globally, then perhaps we should be getting to the time that we wrap this thing up. I'm in the former camp. A lot of people are in the latter, but I would say that every single time Putin has said, look, I'm going to use terrible weapons, he doesn't always use or ever use the word nuclear weapons. And we've said, well, actually, we will cross that red line. He's done nothing. So I think we are acting with a weak attitude and a strong hand, and we should get on and finish the job.
I'm going to hate myself for asking you this, but 40 seconds quickly. What do you think is the number one threat to the world, be it an individual, a dictator, or a country?
I think the number one threat to the world is a all-out conflict between China and the United States that turns nuclear. The good news is I think that's unlikely right now. The Chinese do not want to attack Taiwan before they see how these other 2 conflicts play out. And so there's another, maybe third reason for your senators and your congressmen and congresswomen avoiding World War III.
We did it.
You took us around the world, as you always do. Thank you so much. Glad we can reach out to you and that your hours coincide a little bit better with us right now.
The U.S., Russia, Ukraine, Israel, more of the Middle East, China. We did it all with Ed Price.
Yeah, and as we often say, it's all complicated. Him laying it out, though, so clearly. Ed Price, thank you so much. Senior fellow at NYU, former British trade official. Thank you. This is Bloomberg Businessweek.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Fashion has been all about jeans since the pandemic. Well, and also yoga pants, to be fair. But there are signs that might be changing. I mean, retailers and denim makers, they will need to move fast to catch the next trend.
Earlier this month, Levi released earnings, and after seeing challenges abroad and declines across its home market, the company cut its full-year guidance.
Levi also said it's reviewing options for underperforming Dockers, including a sale as it focuses on its namesake and beyond yoga brands.
For some insight into the company's plans, Molly Smith and I caught up with Levi Strauss, CFO, Harmeet Singh.
We are the market leader, and as the market leader, we're market leader in men's, we're market leaders now in women's. As the market leader, our responsibility is to lead trends and drive people towards our products. We're focused on what we call denim lifestyle, which is more head to toe across both men's and women's.
You're repping it head to toe.
Yeah, and I'm repping it. You can see, the other folks, but denim is having a moment, as you call it. The last cycle started with the skinny, way back in the late 2007, 2008. That lasted for about 8-9 years. We were the first to introduce the looser fit just before COVID, and it took off post-COVID. And the other thing that we really focused on is because the world's become a lot more casual after COVID. You see it in in a hybrid work culture. You see it in other social occasions. And so we are making a stronger pivot to the non-denim piece of our apparel. For men, we've got something called performance tech. It's like the ABC Lulu pant, and that's really gaining traction. And so as we think about, growing the business, it's about owning a larger share of the closet without taking the eye off the ball on what we're really known for, which is denim. And so it's all about denim lifestyle.
I would think a lot of it right now, too, is about wide-legged denim. I mean, that is just like, we had a great story about this recently about, women in particular who are buying, roughly $100 wide-legged jeans and then the $700 wardrobe to go along with it.
What?
Tim's eyes just bulged. So yeah, all of the rest of maybe like the crop sweaters and jackets, because if you've got like a waist that's coming up kind of high, then you want the shirt to kind of hit roughly around there. I'm learning this. I have a stylist. She's telling me all about it. So obviously, Harmeet, you could tell us more about this too.
It's actually, you hit the nail on the head. I was going to talk to you about it. But it's not only about bottoms. And as the fits for the bottoms change, so do the tops. And so as we think about denim lifestyle, we are also focused on growing our tops business, which was up nicely in quarter three. It's up, I think, 8%. But overall, what you saw in quarter three largely was that Levi's as a brand grew 5%. And that's the strongest growth we have had in Levi's over 2 years. Sequentially, it's getting better, and that's why, as we talked about quarter four, while we took our overall guidance for the year down, our belief is sequentially quarter four is slightly better than quarter three.
Well, if denim is having this moment, then why don't you think investors are buying into this? Levi Strauss shares up about 12% so far this year, underperforming the S&P 500. Why aren't investors buying into this? Yeah,
I think what we have done this year is we have narrowed focus into Levi's and Beyond Yoga. We announced the exit of Dockers. Dockers was underperforming. We had a smaller footwear business really based out of Europe. We are exiting that. And we were present in Target through our Denizen brand. We introduced a Levi's Red Tab in Target that had a good run. So, we thought it's better to focus on Levi's and Red Tab. And so as you think about it, I think the fact that we are transforming in the year while we're trying to perform and performing really well on Levi's is, I think, why people are just saying, okay, let the transformation, get complete and we'll buy in. But overall, Levi's as a stock over the last 12 months has had a decent run. We're long on the stock. We're long on, trends of the business. Our longer-term goal is to take the $6 billion business and make it more like a $10 billion business, improving our operating margins by a couple of percentage points. The other thing that is happening in the business is this transformation into more of a DTC first business. It doesn't mean DTC only. It does mean, we lead with DTC, which is our stores, our e-commerce, and wholesale complements our direct-to-consumer business. And that transformation is taking shape. Today, DTC is about half our business. When I joined, it was about a fifth of our business. We're
going to get more on direct-to-consumer in just a minute, but you mentioned Dockers, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the options for Dockers. You did announce that you're looking to sell the business. When I heard that, I think to myself, this is like a perfect fit for Authentic Brands Group. Jamie Stalter is like, Jamie Stalter's group. He's got Airwalk, Aeropostale, Billabong, DC, Greg Norman, Eddie Bauer, Champion, Fry. I mean, I'm only down to F at that point in the alphabet. He's got everything over there, down to Volcom. Does that make sense?
I won't comment about prospective buyers. I would say that the reason we announced the exit of Dockers, we created Dockers. Okay, so it's a homegrown brand that had a wonderful run for a long period of time. We launched Dockers just to, take advantage of the casual Friday that was set in the mid to late 80s.
Casual Friday.
What has happened is it's in a lower growth category, and we're a firm believer that what this does is unlocks Dockers with somebody who can take it to the next level, while we concentrated on taking Levi's to the next level. I've been part of spin-offs and I've seen that happen. To your question about prospective buyers, we announced it so that we would probably hear from prospective buyers. It's early days. Our intent is to sell it. and intend to sell it to buyers that can not only take the brand to the next level, protect as many employees of Dockers as they can, and we'll see where this goes. Phones are ringing, which is the good news. These transactions take time, and when we have something to talk about as to who's the prospective acquirer, we'll definitely talk about that.
Yeah, just call us.
Yeah,
let us know.
Yeah, just pass their phone calls maybe on to us when those phones are ringing. What kind of timeline do you think is reasonable to look at something like that to really complete that kind of a spin-off?
It's a strong brand, and in our view is something like this can take 6 to 9 months. What we're really interested is ensure that it's the right buyer who does the right thing for the brand. And so, we're going to do it in a fast way, but we'll do it the right way.
Right. Well, I think this is the time where we pivot to Beyonce.
Go.
Sure.
Tell us more about this partnership. I think a lot of people want to know about it and what exactly her role is with the brand here. Is Beyonce straight up designing Levi's clothes now? Can I get a Beyonce designed pair of Levi's jeans?
No, it's not about a product collaboration. It's about a partnership with someone. She's an icon. She's been in the center of culture. Her values and our values resonate. She's been a supporter of the brand for years, for decades. And when she named a song after
Cowboy Carter
and the song Levi's, that was organic. She, in 19, I remember she was at Coachella and was wearing our shorts. Again, a very organic thing that she did, and product sales went up on the shorts. So we kind of sat back and said, it's been a great partnership. Could we take it to the next level? And having somebody like her support our brand, support the iconic apparel that we have, the 501s, for example, the T-shirts. Actually, I think we think it's a win-win for both Beyonce as well as us. Plus, we're leaning heavily into driving our women's business. About a third of our business. We see no reason why it shouldn't be half our business.
Right.
And I think she has many fans around the world, and I think the combination of the two brands will make a difference.
Just about 50 seconds, and then we're going to come back for more with you. Have you already noticed a higher sales figure or more loyalty on the back of this campaign? Yeah,
it's early days with the campaign. This is it's a 12-month partnership. We just launched the first chapter. We'll have 3 other chapters. But what I can say is, it's difficult to link, brand advertising with direct sales. But what I could say right now is, as we closed quarter 3, which we just reported, women's sales were up, close to 11%. Iconic 501 was up double digit, and so that's what we believe continues over time.
You guys went public about 5 years ago, again, on the New York Stock Exchange. I was at that IPO because I was working on the floor of the exchange back then. And you guys were able to do something that I think in the, more than 100-year history of the New York Stock Exchange has not ever been done before, which is allow jeans on the floor, on the trading floor there. There's a lot of rules at the New York Stock Exchange. One of them is no jeans allowed. I came in that day, everybody was decked out in jeans.
And wasn't everybody looking great?
Oh, yeah.
Levi's jeans, I assume.
Levi's jeans,
yeah. It was Levi's jeans, and, that was, part of the deal we did with NYSE, as we were debating NYSE or NASDAQ. We said, hey, if you can change the flow on the day of the listing and make it a denim flow, we are in, and they were able to do that, and it was a wonderful, wonderful morning, and, I think beginning of a new chapter for the company.
Understanding how things work between the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, I think that they probably didn't even have to check with anyone. They probably just said yes at that moment. Harmeet, I promise we'd get back to the idea of going direct to consumer and building that relationship one-on-one with the consumer. Nike tried to do this over the last few years, and they really alienated the Foot Lockers of the world, who were such a big part of their business. And now there's a new CEO at Nike. They're trying to turn that ship around, repair that relationship. How do you do this but not alienate the brick and mortar stores who for so long have sold your products?
Yeah, we love our wholesale customers. The second pillar of our strategy is DTC first, but it's not DTC only. The wholesale
DTC, direct to consumer.
Direct to consumer. Wholesale is a big complement to how we're going to grow the business. The reason DTC is important is allows us to provide more of a head-to-toe assortment. We can drive the consumer experience, and is actually a proof point for wholesale retailers to see how the product is taking shape. So our new product introductions, and we have a wonderful product pipeline, hits the DTC flow first. The wholesale customers see how it's performing, and then they buy into it. We need wholesale customers largely because, to be the market leader, we have to reach out to consumers, far and beyond. And the only way to do that is having a combination of a successful DTC business and a successful wholesale business.
So I imagine ideally, you would love to see the DTC base be new customers, adding net new customers to the business. But is there a risk that this cannibalizes the wholesale customer and that they shift over?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I've been asked that a couple of times, and we have not seen any evidence of cannibalization. The other piece is, in the US, our DTC offer is what we call Tier 1 and Tier 2. So it's the best and the better. The offer for wholesale customers more Tier 3. We are talking to a few wholesale customers to introduce our Tier 2 offer, because in the top 50, 60 doors, there is a consumer that wants the higher tier product. So we're not seeing cannibalization. We also don't see cannibalization between the different two channels within DTC, which is e-commerce and our stores. And in fact, consumers now, as like a seamless shopping experience. So our view is that both channels can grow. DTC grows probably faster because we control the channel, we're able to drive the experience, and have a head-to-toe assortment.
We're talking a lot about the U.S. election. It's top of mind here for us. My question is not about the politics of this, but about how you're potentially preparing for another Trump administration, given the tariffs that you experienced during the first Trump administration, when Trump put European steel and aluminum exports, tariffs on those, and then you guys were hit with tariffs on jeans. So there's that part of it, and then a potential more tariffs between the U.S. and China. How do you plan for that?
Yeah, we've been around for 170 years, and we've seen different administrations. The business and the brand has grown through different administrations. And so from our perspective, we believe that, and when we guided Q4, when we talked about a sequential progression, our belief is the brand continues to grow. To your question about tariffs, a couple of years ago, we were importing from China into the U.S. about 15-16% of the product. Over the years, we've scaled that down. So the imports into the U.S. from China is about a percentage point.
Where are you going instead?
And because we have a supply chain, we're able to cross-source it across different geographies. So, we've been able to cross-source it from other countries in Asia. Think Vietnam, think Bangladesh, think Pakistan. And that's really what's really helped us. The cross-sourcing strategy, beside the fact that we're not concentrated significantly in any one country, makes a difference. And so our view is that, any administration, we'll be able to continue to grow.
What about retaliatory tariffs from the European Union or other countries on your own products?
Yeah, I think, we have a strong business in Europe. If you have to cross-source, we can. I think the end of the day is really, how does it impact the consumer? Mm-hmm. Tariffs could mean higher prices for the consumer. And that is something that we will, tackle as the time comes along. Our products provide good value. Okay, and if they're in fashion and they're, we bring in innovation, the consumer is going to gravitate and open the checkbook to buy our product. So, as we think through it, we have contingency plans in place in case, different scenarios play out, and we'll be able to tackle through them.
Is it tempting to think about a 15% corporate tax rate and what you might do with all of that money that's not paid in taxes?
I have a wonderful tax group that plan different tax opportunities all the time. But, our view is, as good corporate citizens, we have to pay the taxes. We'll pay the taxes, and
that is the noble thing to say.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's very important for us to provide great value to our consumers and build the loyal fans, and that's what we focus on.
I gotta say, not many of our guests could pull off head-to-toe denim. And it's not just that, it's also the shirt as well. Harmeet, you're one of those folks who can do that. Harmeet Singh, CFO at Levi Strauss, joining us here in the Bloomberg
Thanks, Tim. Thanks,
Brokers
Molly.
Studio.
Good to talk to you.
Harmeet's going to be featured in the forthcoming issue of Bloomberg's CFO Briefing newsletter. You can sign up for it now at bloomberg.com/account/newsletters/CFO Briefing.
CFO-briefing.
Oh,
don't miss that.
Or else that URL is not going to work.
It will not.
Check out that newsletter, though. You also just Bloomberg, or just Google Bloomberg newsletters. That's
I'm sure it'll come up. We got a whole bunch of them out there.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Josh Reeves co-founded and runs a company that's been valued at nearly $10 billion. The company handles all the stuff it seems a lot of founders don't really want to handle. Things like HR, payroll, benefits, and other stuff like that.
Gusto has raised more than $700 million and does payroll processing for more than 300,000 small and medium-sized businesses. To put that in perspective, they do the payroll processing for more than 6% of employers in the U.S.
It's a lot. Josh is also the CEO of Gusto. He stopped by our studio to talk about his business and the kind of keen vantage point he has on the U.S. economy.
Yes, we do love serving small and medium-sized business. I always love to remind folks they are the foundation for a lot of society. When you think of people and the businesses they can remember, it's often the communities that are near them. One thing we can see in our data, and it's also in the census data, there's a lot of new businesses being formed across the country, over 550,000 new employers in the U.S. in this past year. That's something that got kickstarted and became stronger with COVID, and that's a tailwind to our business because we focus a lot on serving new employers when they hire their first employee.
Where are the areas of strength, at least in your data geographically?
So we see some strength more in the southeast.
So sort of the Sun Belt?
A little bit more Sun Belt.
Okay.
But then we also, and I would point to, published quite a bit of content here. We call it Gustonomics. If anyone is ever interested in exploring.
Yeah, we're interested in that stuff.
Economists on staff, where we try to make that visible to anyone.
No, we don't like data at all. Go ahead.
That's like our thing. But so you're seeing Sun Belt areas of weakness?
Areas of strength.
I know, but so what areas of weakness are you seeing?
Areas of weakness can tend to be more in the major cities.
Still?
That's gotten a little bit better in the last couple of years, but some of that's still hanging on. But it is also industry by industry, and I would need to look back at the data myself. I love to remind folks there's more dentist offices in the U.S. than tech startups. So even though I live in and based in Silicon Valley, we obviously care a lot about that mainstream SMB audience.
Well, so then you have a great window into where communities are developing and moving towards. And I just think about the conversation we had last hour with our Brett Pulley, taking us to a place where, you're seeing a lot of migration happening and something you hadn't seen. The pandemic did that too. So tell us about that shift, what you're seeing, where communities where we maybe didn't have them, all of a sudden you see them really growing up.
Well, it specifically shows up in our business in what we would call multi-state employment. So just the ability for a 5-10 person company now to have employees be in multiple states. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of positive to that. You can access new talent pools. One of the biggest negatives is because of how the U.S. was formed, local, state, and federal rules are quite different by region. And so that's where we also can try to be helpful, is make it easier to kind of abstract that complexity. But we do talk about this compliance inflation concept that is still happening across the country.
Because that means different payroll rules and regulations depending on the state that they live in.
And the county and the town. And a lot of times it's basically highly variable. It ties to what that specific jurisdiction chose to do. And it's not just payroll. It could also be employment filings. It could be compliance requirements. Mm-hmm. Think about just all the different government rules that get created, really agnostic to administration. Generally, it's just been more, not less. And a business owner, especially a small business owner, has to do it all on their own.
How quickly do you get insight into what's going on in the economy? For example, when we see a jobs number for September, a payrolls number that's just, a blowout number, is that not a surprise to you because you're seeing the same thing at your level?
So it increasingly is getting to interesting scale. As you mentioned, we're at over 300,000 businesses.
Like, when will we start talking not about the ADP numbers that we get, but about the Gusto numbers that we get each month?
Maybe Gustonomics becomes that next alternative.
But seriously, I mean, you're 6% of employers in the country. Like, that's a real window. That's a huge sample size.
Yeah, and we see all the data related to benefits enrollment, salary distributions, wage increases or decreases, hiring, offboarding, all that shows up inside our data.
Or the Beige Book calls you up, or the Fed officials call you up, or do they already?
I mean, we have work we try to do on policy side to bring the voice of small business to policymakers. There's a whole host of folks that would like access to this type of data more in the hedge fund world that we avoid and do not engage with, obviously.
So Josh, if there's a net in terms of what you're seeing, your window into the U.S. economy, what are the words you would use to describe the economy based on that data?
Never been a better time to start a small business. And part of that is not just because of the trend we see concretely, but also companies like us trying to help make their life easier.
So is it sort of puzzling to you to see Kamala Harris and Donald Trump out there on the campaign trail trying to make it even more attractive to small business owners?
I don't think it's logical to me that folks are going to evangelize small, medium-sized business.
But you said there's never been a better time.
But the key is, what are you doing about it, right? I mean, small, medium-sized business leads to employment. Employment is a good thing in any kind of politician's career. So, we're agnostic politically, but I'm not surprised that politicians talk a lot about SMBs. There is even lots of good policy, tax credit policy that have been created for SMBs. Again, them actually being able to access these different government programs has been the complexity historically. Okay,
you say it's never been a better time to be running a smaller, medium-sized business. What about a tech company based in Silicon Valley that's been valued at nearly $10 billion, that's raised $700 million in financing? Sounds like your company.
Sounds like, well, I view all of those as byproducts, right? If we can serve hundreds of thousands of businesses, solve real pain in their life, we will grow and have higher valuation, but that's not what we obsess over. But 13 years in, I am really excited. I feel like we're still early in the journey. We only serve 7% of these companies. There's so much more to do.
Well, do you stay then with small and medium sized, or do you go all the way?
So we do have our foundation in small, medium size. And I love to remind folks there's more dentist offices than tech startups, right? I said that earlier. And so, we're only at 6-7% market share. And a lot of tech companies historically just jump to mid-market enterprise. We've built a great business serving small, medium size. We're excited to reinforce that for many years to come.
So you don't need to tap into, I think of, there's you guys, or there's something like an ADP, right? You don't need to service the big publicly held companies, or do you want to at some point?
I mean, we want to solve pain wherever it is, but there's a lot of work to do for small, medium-sized business. One thing I'll share, ADP is a $100 billion plus company. Mm-hmm. Intuit is a company we respect that also cares a lot about SMB. But you have close to 25% of companies in the U.S. today still doing payroll by hand on pen and paper.
So there's a lot of room.
So there's a lot of fragmentation and a lot of greenfield.
You're based in Silicon Valley. Have you spent much time in New York in recent months? And my question is going somewhere.
We have an office here.
Okay.
Be careful how you answer.
Yeah, we love New York. I love New York.
So have you ridden the subway much?
I rode the subway to this office.
Did you see lots of ads for competitors to your company? Because sometimes I get in a subway car and I'm like, I've never heard of this competitor to Gusto. Would be like, it's not Rippling, it's not Deal, it's not JustWorks. I mean, these are all startups that are trying to do what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
I mean, there's a huge opportunity here. So we are excited to compete, press our advantage, launch the best possible product, keep winning market share, keep winning wallet share. But yeah, I would be shocked if there wasn't competition when you have a big market opportunity. I think it is hard to build what we've built from scratch. So I think people take different approaches to it, but we feel like we have a leading position and we want to maintain that.
So do you go public at some point?
We'll be a public company eventually. It's a milestone in the journey, but we're going to be building Gusto for many decades. The thing I anchor on more is we'll be an independent company for many, many decades to come. It goes to why we started the business in the first place.
So, but no pressure to do so, right? You're finding the funding that you need, and and it provides you a certain luxury, right, in terms of building it out.
Well, Gusto at this scale, we're free cash flow positive, have been for several quarters. We can self-fund, be aggressive on R&D, launch new products in the time tracking space, launch new products in the international hiring space, launch new products in the Gusto embedded payroll space. We can talk about that too. But again, there's a huge market opportunity here. And the beauty of being a private company, there's some positives as well.
We work for a private company, in case you didn't notice, and we understand the benefits.
I wondered about different opportunities that are sort of adjacent to the core business here. The idea of catering to specific types of businesses and what you've done in recent years to make it easier for a small gym, for example, or for some sort of hair salon or appointment bookings, like getting into the space that isn't necessarily what you're known for, but are sort of add-ons for the core business.
So first, it comes with customer, pull, right? They're asking for us to help with these additional product areas, and it could be health benefits, it could be tax credits, it could be, business insurance, workers' comp. These are all adjacent pain points, and again, this is where we can be a conduit for. Big companies have had access to a lot of specialists and resources, whether it's cloud, paperless, mobile, or AI as kind of a more recent technology tailwind. We are going to be the ones to bring those benefits to small, medium-sized business. So we have a big roadmap of product apps to kind of go launch, bring live, lots of work ahead.
What exactly does embedding payroll mean?
So think of this as, if you're familiar with Stripe and embedded payments, basically analogous, but for payroll. So one of our partners is Chase. They have a product called Chase Payroll, but it is powered by Gusto. So if you're a Chase customer, a business customer, you will have the chance to go add payroll to your experience inside Chase, but then Chase didn't have to build it all from scratch. So it's another avenue for us to reach SMBs where they are already, versus what we're doing already on the gusto.com side.
Can you do that with multiple banks?
Yes, we have dozens of partners, not just Chase.
Okay.
And we're excited about this big trend. Embedded payroll didn't exist till a couple of years ago. And again, we think it's just a very logical product for any SMB platform out there to launch live.
What's the hard part? You said pretty optimistic, which is great. But what's the thing that you still feel like you have a nut to crack?
Oh, broadly speaking, how to keep improving, running a great company, attracting great talent. 13 years in, I feel like we're early. Everything has to keep changing, evolving, and getting better. We're doing a lot of work to kind of revamp our product suite, our underlying data model. I could go on and on.
30 seconds, international opportunity. You mentioned international. How tough is that?
So on the employer side, the U.S. is like 50 countries. We are U.S. focused today, but we feel like we did a fair bit of work to expand across the country. It's not if, but when we would serve international employers. But right now our focus is on U.S.-based employers. So
if you are a small business owner who has employees outside of the U.S., you can't be served?
You can use Gusto. So I'm talking about employer. On the employee side, you can now hire in over 100 countries on the contractor front. And on the EOR side, you can also hire in over 10 countries, more to come.
Pretty cool stuff. Great. Well, stay in touch. Let us know how things are going. Really appreciate it. Josh Reeves, co-founder and chief executive officer of, I said Gusto, but it's Gusto.
You say both, yeah. Good Gusto.
Let's give it a little joining us here in our Bloomberg studio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Plenty ahead in our second hour of the weekend edition of Bloomberg Businessweek, including free speech. Is it really? Some would argue no. Others would argue that what matters is fearless speech. It's all in a new book.
Speaking of books, how about one that takes a look at what the leader of the free world does with his own money? We're going to hear from the author of All the President's Money shortly.
It's his money because, there hasn't been any female
All the President's Men, All the President's Money. I love how that works.
But there's no female president, so of course you can just use his.
Yeah, good point.
We shall see. We shall see. Plus, we wrap up the hour with the Regenerative Kitchen and some thoughts on how plant-based recipes and sustainable practices to nourish ourselves and the planet. Yum, yum? No?
Yeah.
Good recipes.
I love it all.
Yeah. Exactly.
If it's food, I love it.
Surprise, surprise.
Freedom of speech may be protected in the U.S. by the First Amendment, but it's still something that's the focus of much attention thanks to the proliferation of misinformation on digital platforms, what's been happening on college campuses in the wake of the Israel-Hamas war, and what we regularly hear from politicians.
Yeah, that's right. State and federal officials, for example, already grappling with back-to-back hurricanes that have killed hundreds across the Southeast, have been dealing with another disaster-related threat: disinformation over their relief efforts and the cause of the storm. Unbelievable, the world we are living in. Conspiracy theories and hate speech targeting the government's storm response erupted across social media, especially on X, after Hurricane Helene devastated the region, with former President Donald Trump and ex-owner Elon Musk amplifying unverified allegations.
It's a world our next guest understands well. Marianne Franks is an author and a professor at George Washington University. She's got a new book out. It's called Fearless Speech: Breaking Free from the First Amendment.
We have this incredibly narrow, very legalistic, really reductionist, largely incoherent idea about what freedom of speech is that's based on perceptions and misperceptions of a legal doctrine, of course, the First Amendment. And when we really think about what is important in a democracy, the kinds of hard questions we have to ask about what kinds of speech should be promoted and what kinds of speech should be punished, we need a much richer and more nuanced understanding of speech than you can get from that legal doctrine.
All right, so what is your definition of freedom of speech?
The definition I would use is to say the most important thing for a democracy, that is the most vital kinds of speech that you would want to protect in a democracy, are going to be those kinds of speech that the ancient Greeks referred to as parousia, fearless speech. And the way that they described that really essential form of speech was that you had to be someone who was speaking truly as their own identity, so not trying to cover themselves in some kind of performance or try to disavow some distance between them and their speech. And you had to speak courageously in a critical way about something or someone who was more powerful than you. And the risk that you would be taking in speaking that kind of truth would be to yourself as opposed to trying to cause harm to others.
You know, you say this, and what actually comes to mind is the way that Senator J.D. Vance has answered the question about whether or not Donald Trump won the 2020 election. He's done it over and over again, and his answer was always the same. I'm focused on the future, not necessarily answering the question. He's focused on censorship and what tech platforms did when it comes to censorship. Is he doing fearless speech there?
He's definitely not doing fearless speech there, and he's also misstating what censorship is. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that, you know, for all the problems, and I do highlight a lot of the problems with the First Amendment doctrine, we still want to be accurate about what it actually says. And what it's very clear about is that censorship means when the government is trying to make private individuals say something they don't want to say or is punishing them for something that they've said. Social media platforms making decisions about what they want on their platform or not is not censorship. It does not violate the First Amendment. I think he does know that, and he's trying deliberately to create misinformation about the First Amendment itself.
So when it comes to policing platforms, then, what is your thoughts on social media? Is it media? Is it playful? We know it's dangerous, but it's also a place where a lot of folks get their news, something that we are involved in on a daily basis. Does it need to be policed? And I'm just curious how you think about that.
Well, it depends a lot on what the outcomes are that we want from those platforms. When we say we go there for entertainment, we go there for news, if we care about those spaces in that way, then we need to have the kinds of rules or the kinds of standards or the kinds of design to make those outcomes happen, because that kind of speech doesn't just happen by itself. You don't get to good conversations, entertaining conversations, high value conversations by just letting everybody do whatever they might want to do, because that isn't actually a free speech protective position. What you'll get is a bunch of chaos. You'll get a lot of people who are saying really provocative, stupid, uninformed, really outrageous things, and they will drown out everybody else. So if you want quality speech, if you want accurate speech, you have to have some kinds of standards in play. And every platform knows this because they all have standards in play. There are standards against spam. There are standards against all kinds of rules of privacy regulations, any number of things that every platform is already engaged in. The question is, are you going to wield that power wisely? And are you going to do it in a transparent way? And are you going to take responsibility for the things you leave up as well as for the things that you take down?
I mean, we know how some platforms treat this stuff because of what's happened on X in the last couple of years. But I also think about incentives and the way that incentives could be misaligned right now. You can get paid on platforms by views. So your incentive is to create something that people will see. People see stuff when the algorithm sees that people are interacting with it, leaving comments on it, reposting it, then it surfaces it in other people's feeds, whether that's true or not. It doesn't seem like the system is designed to reward what you refer to as fearless speech.
Definitely not. And that shouldn't be surprising, because what we often forget, and partly because the tech industry and major players in the tech industry try to make us forget this, is that this isn't the public square. This isn't some sort of democracy experiment. This is a corporation that has a product, and it's trying to sell you that product, and it's trying to tell you that what you're doing by speaking or posting or whatever it is freedom of speech. But all it is from the corporation's perspective is profit. And so the only real standard that is being used in those cases is what's going to make that company profit. And so, of course, it's not going to align with democracy. Of course, it's not going to align with high quality content. It's not even going to have the regular guardrails, as you mentioned, of newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, all of whom have to take responsibility when there is false information on them. When you know that the New York Times can get sued. We know that Fox News can get sued if there's outright false statements being broadcast. So why is it that the tech industry gets this pass where they're allowed to do whatever they would like or do nothing, and allow disinformation, misinformation, truly harmful content to simply proliferate simply because it lines their pockets?
I'm curious about what you think about the protests that we've seen on universities and campuses over the last year or so as a result of...
You're at George Washington University School of Law.
You are. At, the Hamas attack on Israel, and then obviously Israel's response. And so it felt like freedom of speech was certainly being questioned, or maybe not allowed equally. So help us with that one, because that was certainly problematic. As we know, a lot of university heads are no longer there as a result. Walk us through your thinking about that and how it might apply.
I think the first thing to note about that conflict, and I say conflict because it's ongoing, right? Mm-hmm. This is something that campuses are struggling with right now, is to say that this should be proof in the first instance that the First Amendment doesn't help us here. It doesn't resolve these questions. You can invoke free speech all you want. You can invoke the First Amendment, but it's not actually going to answer the question of what kind of community do you want to have at any given university? And what are the kinds of threats to that kind of community that you should be focused on? And what I think was really tragic about so much of the demonstration activity that happened in the last few months and the responses by universities is that they, in some ways, looked over their own communities and were speaking to, I think, audiences that were more like members of Congress, or maybe the donors, or maybe the media, but they weren't speaking to their students. They weren't speaking to their own communities and hearing what people were trying to communicate. And of course, the things they're trying to communicate are controversial, they are complex, they can be misinterpreted, they can be rightly interpreted in ways that are maybe concerning. But what you really should have seen from these universities is some leadership about their own community and some grace and some generosity for the students as they struggle through incredibly complex, fraught issues. That's the kind of leadership that I really wish we had seen, as opposed to grandstanding for donors, members of Congress, and others who were trying to weaponize those demonstrations to make their own political points.
The theme of burning is a big part of your book, Fearless Speech, Professor. Burning crosses, burning women, burning books, burning down the public square, and then finally you conclude with choosing your own way to burn. Why is that omnipresent in your book?
For multiple reasons, but one of the main ones is the scene that I open the introduction of the book with, which is the burning of the press, the newspaper, a newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech. And it was Ida Wells's newspaper. And it was burned to the ground after she published an editorial that she had written about the truth about lynching. And it was a moment where I thought, this is really a repeating theme throughout American history. We have this belief, this mythology about the First Amendment that we protect radical speech and we protect dissidents. And then you look back to the people who have spoken out against slavery. You look back at the people who were speaking out against lynching. You look at the women who are fighting for the right to vote. You look at the moments now in terms of Black Lives Matter protests and the Me Too movement. And you see that time and time again, the mob has come for those individuals. They have suppressed that speech. It's been violently suppressed in a way that sometimes took the form of literal burning of newspapers, but sometimes took the form of incredibly onerous lawsuits or persecutions in other ways. So time and again, those who are trying to be most fearless in their speech have been suppressed, they have been violated, they've been assaulted, and that's really a theme that I wanted to emphasize in the book.
You know, just in your intro too, you say unfettered free speech does indeed exist, but only for some Americans. Today in America, delusional stalkers have a First Amendment right to terrorize their victims. Pornographers have a First Amendment right to glorify sexual violence for profit. Businesses have a First Amendment right to deny services to gay people and to advertise this fact. Anti-abortion zealots have a First Amendment right to mislead pregnant women with fake pregnancy clinics. It goes on and on and on. So it is interesting. So what's the answer? What's the way forward?
I think we can. And I think it starts with acknowledging that we've never done it. I think it starts with acknowledging that this is our whole mythology about the First Amendment, the mythology about our country generally, has always been at best an aspirational idea. It's never been a completed project. So for the First Amendment specifically, for the question of free speech, we really have to be confrontational about how throughout our history, the First Amendment has not stood up for free expression, at least not for those who were speaking out against the most powerful parts of society. It has shown up for the people who are the enemies in some ways of democracy and of those who are trying to be egalitarian and progressive. So what we have to do first is we have to admit that. We have to stop telling ourselves this bedtime story about the First Amendment that we've always protected free speech and acknowledge and really grapple with the fact that we haven't. We have chosen winners and losers for the First Amendment. The moment we admit that, then we can have an honest discussion about what belongs in that part of the First Amendment that says it should be most protected, and what belongs in that part that most of us would agree should be something that we're allowed to regulate. Fraud, if we think about defamation to some extent, if we think about the kind of food and drug labeling misinformation that you might worry about, if there weren't any kinds of protocols for those kinds of issues, we need to think about and be honest about the fact that we've always made assessments about harm and speech and injury. And let's talk about how we can do that in the fairest, most transparent way and really think about the context that we're speaking in and care about the harm, not just abstract harms, but actual harms like the one we've been talking about all this time. That is, there are people who are going to die because of misinformation.
Let me ask you so then, is it the Supreme Court who figures that out?
I wish I could say that we should have any confidence in the Supreme Court to do that. I don't think they're going to figure that out anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that the people can't figure these things out. The one takeaway here about the First Amendment being neither necessary nor sufficient for freedom of speech is that we can do free speech, we can do fearless speech without waiting on the Supreme Court, without waiting for the law to change. We can actually lift up, amplify, highlight those people who have taken those risks, even though they had no protections, and we can make those people at the center of our discourse, and we can model ourselves after them.
Professor, what's the link between Americans' trust in media, or lack thereof, and the misunderstanding of the First Amendment, in your view? I'm thinking of a report from Gallup that came out just yesterday that says that trust in media remains at a low, with only 31% of Americans expressing a, quote, great deal or fair amount of confidence that the media will report the news fully, accurately, and fairly.
I think it is a sign that we have, at least two competing problems, or at least two problems that are contributing to this. And one is just a general lack of First Amendment literacy in our public, right? We don't have really good education about what the First Amendment actually does and what it's supposed to protect, because we're losing out on that clarity. The few parts of the First Amendment that really are clear say that you've got to make sure that the government isn't trying to throttle the media. You've got to make sure that members of Congress aren't trying to intimidate researchers. Those are the things that actually are quite clear and quite good about the First Amendment. And if we could get clarity on those, then we could understand why it's so frightening that the government is trying to take hold of media and social media in all these different ways. But that's partly, a lesson for the media writ large too, which is help educate the public about what the First Amendment does and doesn't do.
What hope do you have that things change?
I have hope that things can change because we are at a very dangerous moment in history, but we have had these kinds of moments before. And there have been people who have been willing to stand up, to say the things that are really hard, to act in a way that is against their own self-interest and to try to rescue democracy and to make that promise of equality become a reality rather than just an empty promise. And so I do still have hope for that because I still have hope in people.
I don't know.
You don't seem optimistic, Carol.
Speaking of speech, I feel a little speechless because I think it's such a big discussion of our time, right? In terms of, we talk so much about free speech, and that means people can say things that you don't agree with or can be uncomfortable. I don't know, though, if there's a line that I think you can cross, obviously, when it creates harm. Should it still be protected? I guess I would say no, but
yeah, and I think the way that just the speed at which speech travels now is so fast because of the technology
and the
that
velocity
we have in our pockets
of it, right?
that we're walking. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, Marianne gave us a lot to think about. Timely, certainly, as we, we're thick in the thick of it, and try to be so careful about the information, certainly that we talk about, right? And so careful, but that's not the case everywhere in the world. Marianne Franks, professor in intellectual property technology, civil rights law at George Washington University. Her new book, check it out, Fearless Speech: Breaking Free from the First Amendment. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Who is in the White House, sitting in the Oval Office, will determine policies that potentially impact the money businesses have to invest or to hire workers. Those policies, too, will impact the money we all as citizens have in our own pockets, which kind of got us thinking about the experiences of past presidents and how they were managing their own money. Turns out there's a new book on just that.
Megan Gorman wrote it. She's founding partner of the independent wealth advisory firm Checkers Financial Management. She's also a tax attorney. Her book, All the President's Money: How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money.
She joined Bloomberg Daybreak Europe co-host Stephen Carroll and me while we were at the Bloomberg Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit last month in New York City. We started by asking, why write the book?
So first of all, I've always loved history, like a lot of Americans. And I think it's always interesting to understand where the presidents are a lot like us, where they have their humanity. And money is emotion, and this is a great way to look at presidents across American history in terms of how they feel about money, how they interacted with money, and what were their money values. Now, we are in an election year, so obviously, the spotlight goes to both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris to figure out, do their personal finances impact their policies? And I'd have to tell you, it's not that it impacts their policies directly, right? Fiscal policy is thousands of people working on it. But what I would tell you is it's a lot about sometimes a reflection of things that are important to them. So, for instance, with Trump and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, he increased the unified credit, the amount we can pass free of tax at our death, to now in this year it's $13.6 million. Very much a reflection of his values of generational wealth transfer. In contrast, when we carve into the current tax proposals by Kamala Harris, very much a focus on the middle class. And she's been very clear to all of us that she comes from a middle class background. So there's some correlation there that we can definitely see.
What surprised you in doing this process? And I'm curious, did you get through all the presidents, or how did you pick and choose?
Yeah, I tried to. I got about 34 in the book, because the book sort of looks at the traits I see in my high net worth clients, right? And then tell you stories. So what I found really surprising is how quirky some of the presidents were. So I found letters that LBJ wrote that basically said, I was up at 2 a.m. in the morning, worried about money. And then in the next sentence, he starts talking about buying a suit that would be like somebody today buying a $4,000 suit. Things like, FDR forgetting to file his income tax returns because he lost the paperwork somewhere between Warm Springs and his house in New York. So really fun little things that made the presidents feel much more like we are today.
I love that you point out in the book the two questions that everyone asked you when you told them that you were writing it. Who was the best with money and who was the worst?
Exactly.
Let's start with who was the best.
Okay, so, the best people always means, is that the richest, right? And I think the thing is, wealth has a lot of connotations. So don't laugh, but I would tell you the best with money was probably Herbert Hoover. Grew up an orphan in Iowa, makes his way, and learns how to budget as a child in order to get access to funds to have clothing and food and medicine. Gets to Stanford, goes to Stanford basically tuition free because he was in the first class at Stanford University. And then he takes his geology degree, and through the use of grit and his budgeting, he ends up discovering gold mines in Australia. And so it's really important to note that as incredibly wealthy as he became, he was very, very charitable over the course of his life. I think the other president that we would call sort of the best with money is George Washington. And, over the course of his life, he built immense wealth through, acquiring land and by doing something that a lot of other presidents did to make money, by marrying up. Martha Washington had a lot more money than George, and so it helped him with his net worth by marrying her. So I think the thing about both of them is they both worked really hard, really utilized the skills that they had to build wealth. The one caveat is, and we always have to keep this in mind, is Washington was a slaveholder. When it comes to the worst, I'll tell you, Thomas Jefferson, do not take money advice from him. He was incredibly illiquid, not good at budgeting, really just focused on living a fabulous life. I mean, you wanted to go to his dinner parties, but you did not want to be there when the bills came. And so he lived this very big life, didn't have the money. And I'll tell you, at the end of his life, the last letter he writes is this beautiful treatise on democracy. The second to last letter he writes in his life is to try to buy wine on credit because he just didn't have the money to pay for it. And so that's why Thomas Jefferson just struggled so much with managing his money. So be a Washington, not a Jefferson.
I think people might be surprised, too, that Abraham Lincoln was one of the wealthiest presidents of his era. Yeah. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so Lincoln grew up poor, made a ton of mistakes growing up, right? Would start businesses, they fail. But he finally gets to the point where he studies, he becomes a lawyer, and he does what Washington did. He married up. So Mary Todd was a wealthier woman than he was. So between his law career and Mary Todd's family, he does incredibly well. And when you go to Springfield, Illinois, what's striking is he has the best house in town. But Lincoln really made money when he became president because he rented out his house in Springfield, and every paycheck he would save half of it and put it into treasury bonds and treasury notes that were paying 6% and 7% to finance the war. And so by the time he passed away, he had a net worth of $85,000. Doesn't sound like much to us today, but really it's about $2 million in today's money. But again, Lincoln's one of those ones, he did make some mistakes, died without an estate plan, and the family had to have the Chief Justice of the United States come in and administer the estate. So did some good stuff, but struggled with some other issues.
Megan, talk us through, I really enjoyed the story that you told in the book about Joe Biden and house hunting. Tell us about Joe Biden's relationship with property.
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to remember with Joe Biden, this is a guy who grew up with not a lot of money and early in his life had a very traumatic moment with his wife passing away. And so as a result, when you deal with trauma, you want to be sort of slowing down your thinking. But Joe Biden loves real estate, right? We all know he has the house in Rehoboth, but he fell in love with this very big house in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was a house that he should never have bought on a senator's salary. And it was an old DuPont estate, was falling apart, and he was able to buy the house, but he didn't have the cash flow to keep it up. So he would do crazy things like sell off pieces of the land or only fix up certain parts. And so this house was sort of like an episode of The Money Pit. And it was something he really, really loved because he loved this idea of what the house represented, but he really just didn't have the liquidity. And I think this is something that's relatable to all Americans, right? We all struggle at times to have assets that we might not have the liquidity to manage. So Biden is not someone you really want to emulate. You want to look at him and go, gosh, really think through how you make financial decisions and what will happen 5, 10, 15 years from now based on that decision.
All right, well, we're staying with kind of current presidents or recent presidents. How about the Clintons? Take us to Bill and Hillary.
Yeah, Bill and Hillary Clinton, incredibly smart people. But early on in their lives, they had an opportunity to invest in something called Whitewater. And anybody over the age of 40 remembers Whitewater, right? But Whitewater started out pretty innocently. If I showed you a picture of Whitewater, it was pitched to them to be a retirement community that people would be able to build houses on. And it was beautiful. And when they were pitched this investment, they made a mistake that most people do because they're afraid of looking foolish. They didn't do due diligence. They didn't ask a lot of questions. And they basically got themselves into an investment where really, if you had dug into it, you would have realized this was also going to be a bit of a money pit. And you were going to have to keep adding money in because there was no septic, there was no electricity on this land. And so the Clintons made a series of mistakes with this. Now, what's nice is we still get up till 2016, we could still see their financial disclosures. I think one of the nice things to say about them today is they've really become quite organized with their finances. You definitely see estate planning in place. There's an irrevocable life insurance trust on Bill Clinton. They tend to invest in index funds. So they eventually learn their lesson. But the takeaway with the Clintons is, really do due diligence. Ask a lot of questions about your investments before you put your money to work.
What did you learn from researching Donald Trump's finances?
That could be a whole book all itself. Look, I think the thing about Donald Trump is you're dealing with generational wealth transfer, right? He's generation 2. He inherited $400 million from generation 1. His goal is really to get the money down to generation 4 and 5. So when you have someone with that mindset and you have someone who is willing to take risk and really push the envelope, what you get is a lot of estate planning techniques that are technically correct. That the technique itself is something a lot of high net worth Americans use, but he takes it to such an extreme level that that's where you start to have challenges. I would also say with Donald Trump, he also reminds me of another New Yorker who was incredibly aggressive with real estate, and that was Martin Van Buren. And so Martin Van Buren was also someone who became an attorney, very poor background, becomes an attorney, and starts to learn how to navigate the real estate market so he can aggressively buy land from people. So I would tell you, Trump is someone you just have to watch because of the risk and the fact that they're willing to push the envelope.
I'm still thinking about the role of women in the dowries and the importance in helping out some of these presidents. Our thanks to Megan Gorman. She's founding partner of the independent wealth advisory firm in San Francisco, Checkers Financial Management. Her book, All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Monies.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Earlier this year, Carol and I spoke to Rebecca and Josh Tickle, the filmmakers behind the documentary Common Ground. It's all about the regenerative movement in farming. It's the idea, Carol, that soil health is everything and food production and industrial farming wreak havoc on the environment. Regenerative farming instead undoes the damage that's been done for generations.
Regenerative farming is something Camilla Marcus has focused on for years. She is the chef and founder of Westbourne. It was the first certified zero-waste restaurant in New York City. It's now an online foods business that has the goal to, quote, send nothing to the landfill.
Camilla also has a new cookbook out. It's called My Regenerative Kitchen, plant-based recipes and sustainable practices to nourish ourselves and the planet. We started by asking her to explain the regenerative movement.
I really found the regenerative movement through my work in restaurants. I mean, I'm a professionally trained chef. I've worked for a bunch of different chefs and restaurateurs here in New York City. I had my own restaurant in Soho, and I think when you really dig into the supply chain, you're nothing without your farmers, right? Everything starts at the source. I always say sustainability and food quality and flavor start with our ground. And I really think it was sort of starting in that world about 15 years ago, meeting farmers and realizing the disconnect from who's shopping at a grocery store to what's happening at the earth and how vitally important that system is. It's the only system that can pull down carbon in time. For my generation that's obsessed with climate change, it sort of was this light bulb of why isn't every dollar and every effort that we have pouring into this system and into this massive land transition? And that's really our only hope to solve it.
And yet industrialized farming still exists.
We do a lot of things that aren't logical here in the States.
Well, I am curious, like in your process of building your restaurant and just learning more about this, that how entrenched it is and how difficult it is to shift to more regenerative farming. Can we do it? Like we talk about organic. I don't know, it's still probably smaller, right? Like in terms of
versus conventional.
Yeah. Like, so I'm just like, how do we get there? Because I feel like Chipotle was somebody who talked a lot about trying to do food production in a much, much better way and a regenerative way years ago. So I'm just like, how do we get there? Can we get there?
I think that's really the ethos of the book is if every single one of us made one decision today to do a regenerative practice in their home, whether that's buying a regenerative food at the grocery store, getting in touch with a regenerative farm. So many, especially now the internet, you can buy these products online direct.
Right.
Direct from the source, cooking in a way that's a little bit more mindful of climate. If every single one of us did just one thing, we could turn the system on its head.
Am I moving the needle by composting?
Yes.
Really?
Drastically.
I do
Have
feel
you read the book? I share the data. At carbon. No, but the data's there. You look at the carbon capture. It turns your entire kitchen into being, carbon negative from carbon positive just by composting. And now there's so many home systems. There's no excuse.
Here's why I ask. In a city like New York, we now have composting citywide, but I can't imagine us doing this without having a weekly collection for compost. People live in multifamily, people live in apartments. It's not something they can definitely, necessarily just go throw in their backyard in a composter.
Except now there's companies like Lomi and Mill where you can absolutely do it anywhere. If you own a trash bin, you can own one of these systems and you absolutely can do it anywhere. It wasn't like it was even 3 years ago. Again, I think the technology, the startups, the support, the financial systems absolutely have made composting accessible.
Am I understanding that more and more products are getting marked with regenerative? Like they're noting it. Indeed. So that if you are looking to do the right thing, as you said, each of us can do it by buying a product, starting there. You can find the markings. Is that right? That's correct?
Absolutely. The jeans I'm wearing are regenerative cotton. We're partnering on this cookbook tour with Citizens of Humanity. Mm-hmm. They have the same mission and the same aha moment that I had, which is from the clothes you wear to the beauty products you use to what you're buying in a grocery store. We make more decisions about food and beverage in our daily lives than anything else.
I want to ask you cost, though. And I think about something
Get it a lot.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what the cost is for things and whether this is just a small sliver of the economy that can actually, partake in this regenerative cycle.
I really don't agree that it's just down to cost. And I will say, because I think if you pair it with a more waste-oriented practice in your home, which is what the book, again, holistically is trying to explain. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking about quality over everything and less is more, upcycling things in your home kitchen, not throwing out food. I mean, we all know the stats. We throw out a lot of food in America. It's not that we don't grow enough to feed our communities. It's that we waste too much. If you really think about quality of ingredients, supporting these farms, supporting these products, but buying less and being more creative in how you cook, I think net, you'd have more of the masses participating.
We talk about this. Like I know in my household, like we're trying to shop more often. My daughter spent some time overseas and she's like, everybody shops daily. Yep. It's a very different
Eggs don't
way.
Go in the refrigerator.
Right, mm-hmm. Right, exactly. But this quantity of that we have to have so much stuff, food or otherwise. I don't know how we as a society, certainly here in the United States, get away from that.
I think the truth is we have to. I mean, I think that's what the book is trying to also siren a little bit is in a very beautiful and lovely way, sound the alarm of we kind of don't have a choice of continuing down the path. That's really the truth. So how do we change? Our hand's kind of being forced already, right? The climate crisis is looming. Traditional industrial farming is not working, both from a health and a sustainability standpoint.
So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about...
Climate change is reducing some of the land we've got.
Right? Yeah, talk about some of the issues with modern farming, because I think when people go to the store, they don't necessarily realize that what they're buying may have been grown in a way that isn't necessarily good for the environment, and in fact is bad for the environment. I think regenerative, the concept of regenerative is still very new to a lot of people and unfamiliar to a lot of people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my philosophy is always, I don't know that I care whether someone can define it. I don't think most people can define organic. It means pesticide and chemical free, but I don't think the average person is going to say that. It doesn't roll off the tongue. Same with regenerative. It's really all about the soil. Best way to remember it, soil is a 4-letter word. It's the thing we need to care the most about, and it's the most tied to our health. What's better for the earth is always better for our health. When we have farming practices that care about carbon in the soil and health of the soil, we get better for you foods that are higher in nutrient density.
Do you think the government needs to get involved and say, okay, these things
Absolutely.
are allowed, these things are not allowed?
Absolutely. Look, I always say follow the money, right? We are in an industrial stranglehold in agriculture because of the Industrial Revolution following World War II.
People would say that about fossil fuels in many ways, right?
Exactly.
But anyway, go ahead.
No, the context has changed, but the policies are still sort of stuck back in time. We say we need to be more progressive, go back in time before that industrialization. And the difference you asked about regenerative, the best way to think about it is, in one hand, you're holding that soil that you get when you're planting something in your home. It's black, it has organisms, it's wet, it's moist, versus picking up dirt around a tree, right, on the side of the road or, here in Manhattan. One is chalky, dry, it's sort of a dull brown color. That's the difference between traditional farming and regenerative farming. I'm a visual person, so I like to think of it in that way.
But don't hate me for going back to this, but I mean, in terms of the cost of a regenerative farm, is it more expensive to do right now?
Again, I think it depends on how you look at it. Is it a shift in practices that require capital investment? Yes. Does it pay back and reset the farm? Absolutely. And the biggest long-term shift in that, and whether it costs more to me, is those yields are going down. They are not, these existing farms that have industrial practices and traditional modern farming, they're not able to grow the same that they were last year, the year before, and the year before.
The soils, right?
So at some point, that cost structure is going to surpass. So maybe today there's an argument to say that, but I would argue that's the fallacy that the incumbents want you to believe. It's not actually true when you look at the next 7 years.
So where should we be getting our food?
Couple places. First, as locally as possible. Yeah. Most communities have some form of a farmer's market. I think second, thinking about, again, buying directly from farms. There's CSA boxes, dried products from all these incredible sources from around the country. And then third, going to your grocery store, asking for regenerative brands, talking to the manager, going on shelf and looking for that word regenerative. It's what I talk about in the book, from rice to pasta to sauces to our Westmorn avocado oil. All your basic staples now. There's a lot of brands out there doing the good work.
I think, it is no different than when we kind of shifted towards organic, right? And looking for it. And I think we all have figured out how to do that. What? You look like you wanted to ask something.
I think the Tickles told us the same thing. To go to the grocery store and ask about this stuff, because we're kind of the front line of this.
Right.
The customer.
Always look at regenerative cotton, right? When Patagonia was one of the first to do organic cotton. Now it's table stakes to have organic cotton in your wardrobe.
How often do you find that, organic cotton? I'm trying to think, like when I go shopping.
Organic cotton now is really sort of the baseline, I think. Even,
is it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even at, again, accessible mass market companies and brands, organic cotton's everywhere. It wasn't 10 years ago. Now regenerative textiles is the next wave, like I said, from jeans to, upcycled products for your sunglasses, your glasses that you're wearing. I think you're seeing it actually more trailblazing in fashion and beauty, and I think food's behind, which is what we're trying to catch up.
Your story, though, you started a restaurant. Take us back there. 2018, I believe.
Yeah.
Not an easy thing to do.
If it were easy, everyone would do it. That's what my dad always said.
Tell us about that process.
Oh, gosh.
And what you learned.
Look, opening a restaurant business, period, in this country is very hard. Unfortunately, the country's not so supportive of small businesses. And it's interesting, right? Restaurants are the second largest employer next to healthcare. And yet, they hire more people per square footage. And yet, again, we talked earlier about following the money. Very little incentives. Most restaurants pay 30% in corporate taxes when you tally it all up. Kind of brutal when you compare it to other businesses that employ a lot less Americans. So it's tough. The cards are stacked against you, but I think we're all crazy and for the love of the game, and the impact that it can make, I think, on connecting the food system to all of us in the public. It's powerful.
What do you think is the long-term effect or long-term consequence of what restaurants went through during the pandemic?
Oh, big question. Look, I think
because
fundamentally,
you were very involved in trying to save restaurants. You were out there lobbying for these small businesses.
Trying to save your own.
That was a big part of it.
I helped start Roar here in New York, where we did cash assistance along with the Robin Hood Foundation, as well as the Independent Restaurant Coalition, which is still in existence, working tirelessly. The team is still activated. So I would say the overhang and sort of the pain of it all is still there. I mean, look at what's happening now, in the southern part of this country with the hurricane. It's hard enough to operate these businesses. It really got crushed during the pandemic, and I don't think anyone's really come out of it. And then you continue to get just really heavy regulation every time. When we even talked about penalty, right? You look at the straw ban. Amazon doesn't get a plastic ban, but restaurants somehow, have to constantly go through hoops of, you have to accept cash. You can't do straws. There's all these regulations that come down so that it's a nice headline, but where's really the support for an industry that's always been a big game changer when it comes to agriculture, right? Mm-hmm. Everything we learn about biodiversity often comes from restaurants. You learn about new ingredients, new farming techniques. We talked about organics. So much of that language comes from when you dine out and you learn from chefs around the country who are usually the first adopters. And yet we don't really have writ large government support for making these strong, viable businesses that are critically important to our farming system, important to feed people, and massive employers.
Camilla, why doesn't that happen? Here we are in an election year. Is it the lobby group isn't strong enough or donating enough? Like, I'm just curious because, as you say, follow the money in politics. That's true in terms often of who gets heard.
I think it's that, but I also think it's the nature of the business. During the pandemic, one of our big taglines was, we are each a small business technically, but collectively we're obviously a massive industry. I think that's part of the problem is, right, you look at aerospace, there's a handful, you can count on your hands how many players that the government has to negotiate. I think we get written off because it's, everyone's so different. It's a bunch of small businesses. Who knows what the owners want? But there are very similar through lines through all of them. And I think it's really just the being very daunted that there's so many players involved versus seeing it as a bigger industry like a healthcare, which it is.
Is there also local rules and laws versus federal? Like, I'm just curious.
Local, state, federal. I mean, you name it.
Right, for restaurants.
Look, it's great headlines. You guys know you're in the news business. Yeah. Everything's about clickbait and splashiness. And when you regulate a restaurant or you come down hard on things related to labor, real estate, again, food, it all makes for really good headlines when you pass a regulation, but they don't really think about the ripple effects.
Want to talk about the book?
Yeah, I want to get back to the book. Kind of.
I could go deep on that,
You said nothing's off limits, so I have some really important questions. We have kids that are like the same age. My 5-year-old is a very picky eater.
I love these questions.
What are you cooking for your kids, and how do you get them to eat it?
So I'm going to go back, which is one, grow something in your house. It's a big tenet of the book. I find that children look at food totally differently. Even if you do windowsill herbs and you have them putting herbs in their own dish, quote unquote cook, my son can literally cook his own meal at a stove with a knife. They understand cutting boards. They know knife safety. My 3.5-year-old fully can chop things for me. Have them participate in meals, but it really starts at the source. Grow something. Have them watching my children understand that a strawberry takes a certain amount of time, that a squash is something that they took care of every single day for months. There's a very different, most kids, I would be shocked if a child wouldn't eat something that they actually grew. It's like the part of being human and having an ego. Play into that with your own children. Give them authorship. It's very hard not to get into it when you're part of it. So grow something, include them in cooking, and then give them a lot of agency and choice. Put out different sauces, have them decide. My kids also do our grocery shopping. They go to the grocery store, they go to our farmer's market, and they have to live up to what we call Top Chef challenges. They have to pick a new fruit or vegetable every single month. They have to try something new. Our rule in our house is you don't have to like it, but you have to try it. You can't just refuse. And then we talk about, what are we going to have this week? What are we going to try? What are you into? What did you like? What did you not like? But I think also making it very interactive and giving them a form of agency of, okay, you can have broccoli, but first of all, there's many kinds of broccoli out there. And let's talk to the farmer. My kids have to pay. They have to actually procure their own produce. And then when we cook, let's talk about grilling. Let's talk about, roasting. Let's talk about steaming. Let's talk about raw. And we talk about all those different things and how they can make it different ways. Again, giving them agency. And then I'd say lastly, educate. Kids love information. Talk about what each fruit and vegetable is doing in their body. I mean, my kids will use the word vitamin C. I mean, my 3-year-old knows what that means. Talk about, does it help your eyes? Does it help your bones? Does it help your muscles? And then how does that relate to their day and being higher performance and fuller?
I just want to make the honey nut squash with fried squash seeds. 30 seconds.
I did that over the weekend.
30 seconds. Who is this book for?
Everyone. It really is. It doesn't mean you have to adopt it all, but I get a lot of questions about kids and families and who's it for, the cost. every single one of us could pick one thing out of that book and do it and adopt it and feel really excited and fulfilled after. I promise you will feel better, and you'll realize that it's actually not that hard to make that change. You'll tell a friend, they'll tell a friend, and we spread it like wildfire.
And I feel like the world is increasingly, at least in my circle, moving towards those plant-based diets increasingly. Camilla, thank you so much. This was fun.
Thank you.
Good luck. Camilla Marcus, My
Appreciate
Regenerative Kitchen, plant-based recipes and sustainable practices to nourish ourselves and the planet. I know what you're doing tonight.
It's squash season.
I love squash.
I spent all weekend cooking squash.
Show your kids all the varietals and go make it different ways. Get them involved.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week.
Thank you.
This is the Bloomberg Business Week podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business App. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.